The first time I laid eyes on him was in a corridor at the Royal Liverpool Hospital, sometime in 1988, and he had come up to inquire about a job, and I saw this fellow walking along in a exceedingly dull grey jacket with matching dull grey trousers, and my overall impression was very negative. Of course, I didn't say that to him on the day, but I did mention it to him subsequently, and he remembers it with some resentment.
I know that his commitment to psychiatry has been a long-standing one. I know that it is what he wanted to do as a medical student quite early on in his training. And that love of what he does and his enjoyment and commitment to work comes across really clearly, both in the work that he's done with the college in Wales and on a UK-wide basis.
I mean, I could say that he's the only Marxist I've ever met who makes me laugh. His sense of humour endures through good times and bad times, and that's what I've learned from him. You can always laugh about things.
One of Rob's greatest qualities is his visionary leadership, his capacity to think outside the box, his ability to represent themes that maybe are not centre stage, but understands the relevance and importance of them.
The difference that Rob has made to psychiatry is the approach to psychiatry. It's the more personal approach, but you have to really look at that person and also to understand what led that person to becoming quite distressed, quite ill. And he brings a lot of challenges to psychiatry by daring to challenge the model that we work within and not be afraid to take chances, to be dynamic, to be creative, and really to believe in yourself. But more than anything, believe in the welfare of your patient.
I think his most important personal quality is the ability to see people as they are in a very three-dimensional way. I think that's important in terms of the way that he practices as a psychiatrist, because he's exceptionally good at engaging with and working with unpopular patients and marginalised patients. So he worked in a homeless outreach team, for example. He worked in a very deprived inner city part of Liverpool and formed very good relationships with his patients and the local organisations that sought to represent them.
Rob was first of all involved in setting up a deliberate self-harm register in India, and the main collaborator there has been Murli Krishna, who's worked in Liverpool and in North Wales, and then 5 or 6 years ago went back to India. And I think without Rob's networks and without his commitment to completing something, not just kind of starting it, and his ability to build a team, to create partnerships and work together, really, I don't think it would have happened.
I will remember him as a great social psychiatrist who really cared about his patients. I'll also remember him for his blog, Khrushchev's Shoe, which is about mental health, music and politics. And when I'm confused about a current situation, I turn to Khrushchev's Shoe, and Rob will always give his particular view on something in a brilliant way.
I've been impressed by Rob's ability to hold strong viewpoints and at the same time still respect and listen to those of differing viewpoints and seek to find common ground and understanding.
He's very principled, and he takes a principled stance on government legislation, service development, issues around professional boundaries, interface between psychiatry and religion. The position he has taken has not always been popular, but it's been driven by very clear, consistent principles which are openly articulated.
If I were ever to become unwell, distressed, going through a very bad, mental health episode, I would always want somebody like Rob Poole to be my RMO. I think we're working in an environment where we are witnessing a lot of distress. We're trying to do the very best we can as professionals, informally or whatever. And sometimes, it can be very overwhelming, but somebody like Rob, who still has those qualities to be there for you, to give you options available, and to listen to your story, I really, really rate him very highly.
I think he deserves the Lifetime Achievement Award, firstly because he's a great social psychiatrist, but secondly because he combines the work of a clinician, a researcher, and a policymaker in a way that I think should be quite inspirational to trainees, that you can do all those three.
I think Rob's unusual in that he's contributed over a range of things and over a very long time to an unusually high standard. So this isn't a flash in the pan, it genuinely is a lifetime achievement, and as I say, encompasses many different dimensions.
Joining me today is Dr. Rob Poole, and what you just watched was the 2017 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. I was very shocked and a bit surprised, but it's a lovely thing to have happened.
I can't even imagine. And you did the music for your own video.
I did the music. Yeah, I did.
A blues lover here in Austin.
Yeah, absolutely. Very pleased to be here in Austin, as I say.
Okay. Well, with that, I just want to go ahead and go into your background a little bit more,
Sure.
Additionally to what some of those people had to say. But you're co-director, along with Catherine Robinson, for the Center for Mental Health and Societies, a methods-based research center that conducts research with a translational application to the well-being of people with mental health problems and to the mental health of the general population. So what does your work with that group entail?
Okay, well, the idea, the concept behind it is that it's a coming together of social scientists and clinicians to do research that, it furthers knowledge, but it also has some relevance in the foreseeable future to individual patients and the population at large. So our interest tends to be around things like social factors. We don't do clinical trials. We don't do drug trials, for example. We don't do psychotherapy trials. We're interested in how factors like social inequality affect mental disorder. We're interested in clinical skills and how they can be best disseminated. We were interested in how suicide can be prevented at a public health level. So we although there's a very important element of preventing suicide that's about clinical practice, there's a very important element that's about public health in the same way as infectious diseases have to be controlled both by treatments for individual people but also sanitation and healthier environments.
Although mental health issues can negatively impact the lives of many, some people watching might be wondering, how does this impact me? So for people who don't identify as someone with a mental health issue that requires treatment or may not be close to someone who does, how does this work directly or indirectly impact someone like that? What are the broader social impacts that we could all be subject to?
Okay. Well, first of all, everyone's affected by mental illness, in particular by serious mental illness, because nearly everybody knows someone. In fact, everyone does know someone. You may not know that there's someone with a serious mental illness, but they're likely. It'd be very difficult to lead a life where mental illness didn't have an impact in some way. And if you're talking about things that are related to mental illness but not exclusively related to mental illness, like self-harm and suicide, this affects nearly everybody. And if one pretends that it doesn't, then there's a kind of an element of denial there. This affects nearly everybody in one way or another. But more than that, across the board, across all health domains, physical health, mental health, public health, the same factors have an adverse impact on us all. Stress, social inequality, living conditions, insecurities, the things that are good at preventing physical and mental health give people better lives as well. Some people, for one reason or another, have greater vulnerabilities and become unwell, But actually, even those of us who remain healthy, our lives can be improved by the same things that actually improve the well-being of people with mental health problems.
Okay, so that reminds me a little bit of initiatives for education and reproductive rights for women in countries where those things are difficult to obtain.
Yeah.
And the idea that when women are empowered in a country, usually, almost always, the country does better as a whole.
Yeah.
Because the initiatives that help one group raise the level for the rest of the nation.
That will be exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm with you so far. So, you've been a phone guest before on the Atheist Experience, and you were also on our original Godless Bitches podcast, where you were able to talk about your views on mental health and society at length. But for people who haven't seen those episodes, can you recap what is the impact of social inequality on mental health, and what are your views on how to best address it?
Of course, I'm an academic, and I end up wanting to give a whole lecture that will go on and on. So I'm going to try and keep it fairly brief. It is very clear from some very robust work that's been mainly conducted by a guy called Richard Wilkinson, who's a sociologist, retired now, working in the UK, where if you look at social inequality between nations, there's a relationship both with physical and mental health of those nations that's very directly correlated to inequality. So there's something, if we get into slightly rarefied kind of statistical area here, but there's something called the Gini coefficient, GINI, which measures, it's simply a mathematical measure of the extent to which inequality exists in any particular population. It measures the difference between everyone having the same, or one person having everything and everyone else having nothing, and then all stages in between. And if you look across, at least in high income, upper middle and high income countries, then what you find is that there's a very direct correlation between income inequality and ill health. And actually that's much more important than income. In high and middle income countries, not when there's absolute levels of poverty in a country. So levels of many illnesses in the United States are higher than they are in rather less wealthy but more equal countries like the Scandinavian countries, for example, because your levels of inequality in the United States are very high by international standards. Exactly the same thing is evident for mental health. Generally speaking, this is something that plays across a whole nation. It isn't a local inequality, it's a kind of national inequality. If we look at more severe mental illnesses, which are often thought of being genetic or neurological in nature, like schizophrenia, actually the finding is that these are more associated with deprivation and inequality than the, in some ways, less severe conditions like depression. So when you look at who is most at risk of schizophrenia in the UK, being black is a big risk factor. And growing up, but only if you grow up in the UK, however. If you grow up in the UK as a black person, well, it's very suggestive that there's a social factor, a major social factor in being involved, and it's hard to feel that isn't something about racism and racial inequality. We also know that if you grow up in a deprived inner city area, you have a much higher risk of developing schizophrenia. And depending on what studies you look at, this is a very major factor, up to 8-fold, if you take the two factors combined. A much bigger risk factor.
So are you saying combining a racial inequality with income disparity?
Yeah, with growing up in a deprived inner city area.
Oh, okay.
So schizophrenia appears to be there's something about inner cities. Now, I have a hypothesis, it's only a hypothesis, which is hard to test, that this might be something to do with local inequalities, actually. That if you grow up in inner cities, life's very difficult, you can't access the better things in life. Not only do you have not very much money, but everything you can access is more expensive. So in the UK, people without cars can't shop in supermarkets, so they shop in corner shops where their overheads are much higher, so all their groceries are much more expensive and are in an even greater proportion with
Right.
a small income than they would be otherwise. So, but also one is confronted in a city area quite close by with the good things that you can get in life. The wealth is right there beside poverty in inner city areas. Now, that's a hypothesis. I can't say I've got any evidence that's true. But what there is very clear evidence about is that growing up in deprived circumstances is actually much more important than what happens subsequently to you. That this is a very major factor on its own.
But just to be clear, I remember having a discussion with you where I asked about whether it was sort of the floor versus the ceiling, and if you raise the floor but you don't keep the ceiling where it is, like, does that make a difference if people are less deprived but the disparity differential
Well, we know the answer.
same?
We know the answer to that, and raising everybody doesn't make any difference.
I remember
it's the
you telling me
inequality.
that.
It's the inequality that matters.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that. It was very interesting that somebody had already answered that it wasn't just about deprivation, it was about the contrast in deprivation too.
And how difficult life is compared with the other more privileged people around you. Yeah.
Do you have any ideas on why you think that there would be a national boundary around that?
No.
I mean, that's an interesting
It's very
thought.
puzzling. I mean, the UK, United Kingdom, well, these, clues in the name. It's 4 nations. They're very different to each other. And yet it seems to matter what happens within that national boundary. What's so special about a national boundary?
know.
I mean,
Yeah, that was the first
Now,
thing.
I suppose one suspicion is that it's got to be on a large enough population size to have an effect, and it probably isn't the case.
But clearly it's not the issue, like a global boundary, right?
No. I can't explain that. I mean, I guess, I suppose my position is, let's fix it. Let's not worry about why too much.
Okay. And so what are your views on how to best address it?
Well, I think it's quite clear. Since about 1980, there's been a major change in the way that the international economic system works. We have ended up with this neoliberal system. Not everything about it has been bad. So some major problems have been solved in that period of time. Some major indices of global mental health have improved. However, the promise of the neoliberal system was that everyone would benefit, and that isn't the case. We know that some things that had been steadily improving went into reverse after a while. We know that, for example, in the UK, we've had 10 years of steadily dropping public expenditure, of deteriorating social fabric, and increasing inequality. People have remained in employment by and large, but the rewards of employment for the people at the bottom of the scale have plummeted, actually. And what we see is the consequences of that in terms of both deteriorating physical and mental health. For the first time, I think it's for the first time since the First World War, life expectancy is dropping in the UK. It's steadily gone up. If you go back 10 years, life expectancy was improving so quickly that every day you lived, you only used up 21 hours of your life expectancy. It increased by 3 hours in the same 24-hour period. I know it sounds incredible, but this is true. And that's gone into reverse. Where we have to address it, I think, is to move away from a neoliberal system. We have to move to a system where we tax and we spend, and we try and put everyone on a more even footing. And that doesn't mean everyone has to be exactly the same, but it does mean that we have to see a reduction to a lower level of disparity than we used to have, a fairer system, a system where the rewards are more reasonably and evenly distributed, because that's good for everybody. Because, and the interesting thing about it is, it isn't just health that's affected by this. Levels of all kinds of other social problems are very affected by these inequalities, income inequality.
Like things like education, or?
Yeah, literacy and violence and crime, all kinds of things. I mean, I'm not saying that you can create a utopia where there are no problems, but you don't have to create a dystopia where things are getting worse,
Okay. No, I think that makes sense. So I've asked you on today to discuss your current project, which is the South Asia Self-Harm Initiative, which is branded Sachi. And you've been involved in Sachi from its inception, and you've expressed a desire to collect good quality data about suicide and self-harm in South Asia in order to develop strategies for sources of help and prevention. first of all, tell me a little bit about Sachi and what motivated you particularly to become involved.
Okay. I'm a social psychiatrist. I have spent most of my career establishing services for marginalised people and activities related to that. I became a full-time academic quite late in my career, about 10 years ago. And I've always been interested in India because, in the United Kingdom, we have many, many, many doctors from South India. So from India and from South Asia, from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, particularly India and Pakistan, who are colleagues. And so it's always very interesting that the culture has had a big impact on us. But I'm not much of a traveller.
Okay.
So
I would not know that from all the travelling you do.
No, I know, but I actually quite like my own home and my own guitars and my own, stuff, and my wife, of course. There was a colleague called Murli Krishna who invited me to go and speak at a conference, and I said, yeah, sure, I'll come and speak at the conference. And then they kind of said, can you give us some help with some research? Mm-hmm. And then I went back the next year with Catherine Robinson, and we started applying for grants, and it kind of grew from there. So this grew very organically from a request from within India.
Okay.
And it's the point about Sachi, and what's I think important about Sachi, is that whilst I'm a psychiatrist and many of the people involved in the psychiatry, it's led by a social scientist. It's led by Catherine Robinson, who's a professor of social policy research. It's very much about research questions that are set from within that within the country, where we get involved on a kind of partnership that's definitely reciprocal. It's not an act of charity, but it's not an act of exploitation either. I mean, South Asia, people have got quite mixed feelings about the British Empire, the colonial legacy,
sure,
and indeed some of the things that are still going on. So it's doing things on a partnership that is mutually beneficial is a very important part of what Sachi is about.
It also improves relations in some way in some areas.
It does.
Okay, good. Who are some of the other stakeholders who have influence over the goals you're trying to achieve, and what steps are being taken to appeal to or partner with them?
Okay. So we're not the only group that are working on suicide and self-harm in South Asia. But it's a relatively small group of people overall. We have formal partnerships as Sachi. We have our partners in Pakistan, in Karachi, the Pakistan Institute for Living and Learning. We have partners in India, the Mysore Medical College and Research Institute, and a number of other hospitals and other and some NGOs in India. We have a partner, Oxford University is involved. Professor Keith Horton from the Centre for Suicide Prevention at Oxford University, and Nazrat Hussain, who's a professor of psychiatry in Manchester University. So those are the formal partners.
Okay.
But we also have, we've been very active. We got the grant for Sachi just over a year ago. We've subsequently put in for other grants. We've been successful in one case. We're waiting for outcomes for further grants. We've involved other stakeholders in a total of 7 countries in South Asia. In fact, they're not partners in Sachi per se. Who sets the goals? Well, the goals are in part set by funding bodies. In this case, the UK has 7 research councils which have been brought together to administer a global challenges research fund, and that's where we got our money from for Sachi. In some extent, it's set by the World Health Organization.
Okay.
And by the UN and by bodies that actually recognise suicide as a major public health problem, particularly in low and middle income countries, but across the whole globe. Though the rates of suicide are actually fluctuate, but overall are down a bit in the UK, across the world they're growing. And they're growing quite fast in particular groups, women, young people. I mean, there's a number of groups that cause great concern. And again, one of the principles of Sachi, which I think is an important principle for the future of health research in general is, I mean, it doesn't make sense to see things purely in national terms. We have to see things on a global basis. We are very, very interconnected. I know that Britain is hurtling towards Brexit and pretending it can separate itself from Europe, but in fact, this is we're going to have to come to some other relationship because we are all very, very closely interconnected, and what happens in India affects us in the UK and you in the US and the other way around as well.
Okay, so global links.
So understanding things on a global basis, and that makes sense because, I mean, we do know that most of the interventions that have made a big difference to overall health of the population have been public health measures. If you just take sanitation on its own, it's a massive step forward, a much bigger effect than treating people. We eradicated smallpox through immunisation.
Right, polio.
That affect the whole population. So taking measures that affect the whole population can have very big effects. And there are good reasons to suppose that that's true with suicide and self-harm as well.
That we could apply those same
That we can apply the principles. Well, just to take an example, access to means of suicide. If you can restrict access to popular means, this leads to a reduction in suicide rates. People used to think that if you restricted access to one means, people would simply use another means, but that turns out not to be true. So,
wow,
yeah,
that's interesting.
Well, to give some examples, in the UK, until the mid-60s, the domestic gas supply in the UK was coal gas, which has got a lot of carbon monoxide in it. So people would suffocate themselves. They'd stick their heads in the oven.
Right.
And that was not actually asphyxiation, that was poisoning with carbon monoxide with carbon monoxide. From the mid-60s, we had North Sea oil, and that led us to using natural gas, which had a very low amount of carbon monoxide, and suddenly putting your head in the oven was much, much less likely to be lethal than it used to be, and people don't do it anymore.
But you're saying that
and it led to a stepwise drop in the suicide rate that was quite persistent. It was persistent over years.
Okay.
We know that countries where there's free access to firearms have higher suicide rates than where they're not. In India, Pakistan, actually the whole of South Asia, there's a big problem with people taking organophosphate pesticides. What in the UK we would call sheep dip. These are substances that in rural areas are household substances. They're available undiluted, and people drink them. Now, there's good reason to think that restricting access to undiluted organophosphates would lead to a substantial reduction, and indeed some measures in China to that effect seem to have had exactly that effect. However, there's also been some research looking at some local measures to contain access to organophosphates, such as having communal pesticide stores that have failed. So it looks, and to me, my interpretation of that, it's just my interpretation, is that you need to actually restrict access from a much larger population if you're going to be successful. So just restricting access to lethal means. Now, that's just one bit. And if you're going to reduce suicide rates in any particular country or region of the world, you have to do many things.
Right, so you're talking about a single step.
But that's one part of an overall program, and you need to have very good evidence, data, knowledge of how things vary between different regions, because at the moment, most of our knowledge comes from the West. Most of it comes from United States, Europe, Australasia. There are some reasons to think some things are the same, and there are good reasons to think some things are different. And what we need is some primary data from South Asia. So what Sachi is about collecting, the core of it is about collecting good quality information about from the population in South Asia, so we can begin to understand what might be effective. one of the other points I really want to make, as I'm on a roll, it seems at the moment, is that, and this is generally true in psychiatry and the rest of medicine, what being well-meaning isn't good enough. Sometimes things you think might be really helpful, because from good intentions, can turn out to be really unhelpful.
Sure.
So you really need to have good evidence.
Right. Intuitive solutions are often incorrect.
That's correct.
Yes. That's one of the things that I think I've learned here from the gun debate. A lot of the initiatives and things that we spend time dialoguing about aren't even really large factors in gun violence. So it's kind of interesting how the dialogue gets consumed by what it would be considered minor factors of gun violence as opposed to the larger factors.
Sure. Well, I mean, we in Europe, of course, certainly in the UK, we look at the debate about gun control in the United States with some puzzlement. It seems pretty clear to us, but clearly not here.
What is the relevance of culture to self-harm?
As people will see if they look at the Sachi website, the rates of self-harm and suicide in South Asia are astronomical. Probably WHO, World Health Organization, estimates 5 times the European prevalence of suicide. We know from studies that have been conducted predominantly in high-income countries, but nonetheless pretty good studies, that the depictions of suicide in the media have an impact. When Robin Williams died, there was little epidemic of suicides, and you can frequently show this. You can frequently show when high-profile people take their own lives. How it's reported has quite a big effect. These are cultural factors, but there's also factors such as patterns of help seeking. What do people actually do when they're distressed? This is affected by culture. Equally, how do people accept interventions? Our partners in Pakistan have done some work doing psychosocial interventions, which they don't present to people as therapy. They present them as giving them some skills to help to cope with things. And actually that rather subtle semantic change makes it much more acceptable to people to accept the intervention. So there's many cultural factors here. Some of them are quite difficult. Some cultural factors. So we know, for example, that in India, across most of the world, the rates of suicide for men are approximately double the rates for women. So, or put a different way, 1/3 of all suicides are women and 2/3 are men. We know in India that men and women equally take their own lives. We don't know whether that's related to the position of women in South Asian societies, which is very different from position in high-income countries. On the one hand, as Western academics, health professionals, it's difficult for us to go and say, oh, you're doing everything wrong. But on the other hand, there does appear to be something that as a prima facie case, that there might be something about the position of women in those cultures.
I think the thing that first puzzles me about that would be that if we had particular factors that cause a certain percentage of men in a population to commit suicide, then as the society became more egalitarian, I guess I would expect the women's suicide rates to catch up, not to decrease.
Well, we do see that in the West. We do see something that corresponds to that in the West.
But you're saying that in a culture where there might be more disparity between the roles or the positions of men and women, there's actually more equality with regard to the rates.
Okay, I'm not saying this is the correct thing, but I'm going to offer it as a hypothesis.
Okay.
So supposing you have more choices as a man than a woman, that might well then have an impact when you feel despairing. So if you experience yourself as having little agency in your situation, that then might make it more likely that you'll do something desperate.
Oh, I understand that, yes.
Now, both things can apply. I mean, we do see certainly in the UK, in my working lifetime, which as a psychiatrist, which starts in 1981, so it's about, I can't think, more than 35 years. Some behaviours that were very rare in men have become much more common, such as self-laceration has become much more common in men. It was once almost exclusively women, and now we see it in both sexes. And we also see rates of homelessness rising amongst women who were very rarely represented amongst the homeless population 30 years ago. So we do see the kind of problems becoming less gender specific as the society becomes relatively more egalitarian as far as gender is concerned. But that doesn't mean that other factors can't have the same effect, despite the fact it's the opposite, things moving in the opposite direction.
Clearly.
Unfortunately, life is just like that. It's really complicated.
Okay, that's fair enough. And so moving on, Dr. Peter Taylor was also good enough to put up a video, and he addressed the difficulty of seeking help and support. Yeah. He indicated that similar issues exist in the UK, but in South Asia, there are additional contextual challenges to seeking help. What are some examples of additional difficulty for people on an individual level and insofar as the available services?
Okay, so there's two questions in one, really. Just to take one important example, shame. Shame in British culture is not a particular... I mean, shame exists. It is an important adverse experience, but it doesn't have quite the same potency in British culture as it does in some South Asian cultures. And in particular, shame tends not to spread to entire family groups as it can in South Asian cultures. And that can make it very difficult to acknowledge that you've... for example, harmed yourself in a setting where that is regarded as a shameful act, as an especially shameful act. That there are real major problems around accessing mental health services, particularly if you live in rural areas in low and middle income countries. People living in in urban settings are quite likely to be able to access hospital services, for example. But if you live 2 days' journey from a large city, then there's not a meaningful ability to intervene. Now, I think it's unrealistic to think we could ever develop the same level of mental health support for people across the whole world as you enjoy in the US, where you've got about half the world's psychiatrists working. literally about half them work here in the US. Yeah,
we're a nation of psychiatrists and lawyers.
Yeah.
Okay.
The two things may be related, but I mean and it may not even be that formal mental health psychiatric intervention is the most appropriate thing. So we did a study. We looked at 20 people who had survived a serious act of self-harm, sufficiently serious, in fact, that they'd been admitted to hospital. And we found that about 16% of them had a major mental illness that might benefit from treatment, whether that's psychological or medication or something similar. The rest of them had really difficult social circumstances of one sort or another. So it might be that the solutions are about things like, well, does seem certain that one of the major factors in India that affects their very high rates of suicide in the rural population, particularly amongst farmers, is debt. And in particular, very severe debt. I'll put some flesh on that, really. So families live around small farms. This has been an agrarian society for a long time, and even though it has urbanised very, very quickly, still quite a large population, a proportion of the population, much more than half, live in agrarian settings. We've got climate change, and a drought in particular is a big problem. Now, if you're in India, you get 4 harvests a year. At least in South India, you get four harvests a year. But that depends on irrigation, and if you're not getting sufficient rainfall, you can't irrigate, and therefore you can't have 4 harvests. So you now got 3 harvests. Now, under older systems of subsistence farming, if you miss a harvest, everyone kind of scrapes by and then you get going again. If you're on a cash economy where you're growing cash crops,
Sure.
The loss of that income becomes much more difficult to bear.
Right.
And then the sources, bearing in mind people have got very little to secure a loan against, the rates of interest people pay are very high, and the size of the loan that people take out is very large. It might be a year's full income, creating no realistic possibility of ever ridding themselves of the debt, and therefore there's a spiral that develops. Equally, people can sell their farms to much larger conglomerates who are very willing to buy small farms for what appears to be an astronomical amount of money, 2 years' income. But the trouble is, then the family's source of income is gone.
Right.
And now what are you going to do? So debt and financial straits are a major factor, we think, in driving these very high suicide rates. Now, there's no sense in saying, okay, well, we'll give them antidepressants and they'll be okay. You've got to do something about the debt crisis. That might be, I don't know. I mean, I'm running ahead of myself because I'm suggesting what the solutions might be, and I'm very keen to say I don't know what the solutions will be at the end of this. But one of the things one thinks about is there some variant of a credit union that might actually allow whole communities to be more resilient in the face of drought and debt? I don't know.
Right, but it's definitely something that it opens itself up to testing.
Absolutely.
Like, let's try this. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And test from proper data rather than speculation.
Right.
How plausible such a thing might be. But equally, it still needs to be culturally appropriate. It needs to be something that people can accept and will work within the context of the society as it actually functions as a whole, not as just one narrow problem.
Sure. Well, like you were saying, different steps, right?
Yeah.
Okay. In the materials that I reviewed, the term self-harm was often used to refer to suicide, but how does Sachi use the term self-harm, and what is the philosophy behind your usage?
Okay, well, basically, we followed the standard use. So self-harm, on the one hand, self-harm does embrace intentional taking of one's own life. But it also embraces acts where you harm yourself, where you don't intend to end your own life, which are much commoner than the actual suicidal acts. And you can't do large-scale research where you really can make a reliable estimate of someone's intentions when they did something. So the literature talks about self-harm, which includes all forms of self-harm, and suicide where the person dies. Because if you try and make a distinction, there used to be a distinction made between suicide and parasuicide. So parasuicide looked like suicide, but it happened without suicidal intent. But actually, for various reasons, as a method, this doesn't really work. So it's far cleaner to say, okay, self-harm is all forms of harm. And we used to talk about deliberate self-harm as well. But it does also includes an element of intention, so we get away from that. The question is that the harm was inflicted by oneself, and we leave aside the question of the extent to which that was intentional.
Are there forms of self-harm that families may not recognize, that someone could be doing, and not necessarily even hiding, but that you would not even recognize as self-harm?
Sure. I mean, probably the majority of adolescent self-harm is self-laceration. Families wouldn't know about. It is intrinsically a hidden behaviour.
I guess what I'm asking is, would there be something that would be more mild that I might even know that someone was doing, but I wouldn't know to categorize it as a self-harming act because I'm not that informed? Is there anything like that, or is that or would all of it be obvious?
I mean, I suppose people do. Well, the simple answer is no.
It would be obvious.
These would tend to be if you saw the evidence of it,
right.
It would be fair. It might be concealed.
Right.
People do talk about self-harm equivalents, bits of behaviour, recklessness, for example, but being the austere scientist
Okay.
here, it's speculative,
Okay.
and we try and avoid getting into understand things in terms of assumptions that we put upon observations.
Okay. So what you're saying then is that the things that would fall into self-harm, most people would be able to intuitively recognize it if they were to observe it.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
If self-harm refers to more than suicide, does it always escalate?
No.
Okay, so a person could stay at a certain level of self-harm.
Probably the majority of people do. So just to be clear about this, an act of self-harm does increase your risk of eventual suicide.
It's the gateway action.
And it is a risk factor. And whilst people who recurrently harm themselves, saying they want to kill themselves but not being successful, so to speak, tend to be disregarded as attention-seeking, actually they're at very high risk of eventually dying. Now, the vast majority, but not all these behaviours have got self-destruction as the intention. So there's a large number of people who cut themselves to relieve tension. It's not to get responses from other people, and it's not to try and end their own life. It's because the act of cutting the flesh relieves an unbearable inner tension. And that's often indicated by the locations where people cut themselves. So a common place is on the thighs, outside. So on the one hand, acts of self-harm are a risk factor, but on the other hand, the majority of people who harm themselves will not end up killing themselves.
Okay, and one other thing I wanted to ask is whether there are other factors then that should be considered when you make an assessment about, let's say that you find out that somebody that you care about is self-harming. Is there something else you should be concerned about, or any other flags that you could see before they actually attempt a suicide that might be a sign of escalation?
Sure. So it's very difficult to give really great, simple advice that will be robust under all circumstances. On the one hand, if people are doing minor acts of self-harm, I'm not sure they're saying they should be ignored, but overreacting and rushing them straight down the emergency room isn't necessarily the best thing to do. It can be a serious escalation of the situation, actually. If people are saying they want to kill themselves, then it's important to take that seriously, and particularly to be with people. I mean, not to say no, you don't want to kill yourself. Actually, I don't.
I've done my part.
Or no, don't be silly. Look at all these wonderful things that you've got to live for.
Right.
But just being with people and letting them talk about it is really an important thing.
Okay.
If people are becoming more hopeless, then that becomes very worrying. If people are beginning to show signs of really, I think the key thing that I see as a psychiatrist is at the point at which people dismiss everything good in their life and are overwhelmed by the things that are bad.
Okay.
So all sense of balance is lost, which is why it doesn't work to ask people to balance up the good and the bad things, because people dismiss the good things and are overwhelmed by the bad things. And a lot of the time, at an individual level, both as a clinician and as a just general member of the public, keeping people going when they're feeling despairing is relational. It's about being with them. It's about being alongside them and knowing they're not alone, and that there's some place and there's someone that feels more hopeful than they do, without actually trying to persuade them that they're wrong about everything necessarily, because that will not work most of the time. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but would I take away from that then that are you saying that somebody that might be escalating to suicide would be prone to express that in some way, to want to talk about it?
Vast majority of people who go on to kill themselves will tell someone that's at some point that's what they're building up to, that's how they're feeling.
And is there anything, and is it just that sense of imbalance that might occur prior to them actually saying, I'm thinking of ending my life? Or is the flag, now they've expressed that they are thinking of ending their life and that's the flag?
Well, I think people who start making practical plans, start tying up their affairs, the kind of thing that someone gives away their dog. I mean, it sounds trivial, but actually that's a really ominous thing.
Okay.
People start making
So
arrangements.
if you had a child, for example, that was engaged in cutting,
Yeah.
what would be a concerning escalation?
Well, I think I'm no child psychiatrist. That's the first thing to say. I treat adults, not children. I think it's important not to see it as just an escalation of one behaviour. So a child who cuts probably, again, it depends on their age and the degree of the cutting and the extent to which they feel out of control. A child who takes an overdose really people need to understand what's happened there. They need to talk to someone that they're not emotionally involved with, to help them understand why they did that and what might have been driving it. There isn't always a clear pattern of escalation.
Okay.
It's surprising how often people around them find it's come out of the blue or it's completely incomprehensible.
Okay.
It's the opportunity to share things with somebody else. And often it's about sharing things with someone who isn't directly in their own domain, because there's all kinds of other complications. That isn't to say that family members are going to have a bad effect, but it can be very difficult to talk about very difficult emotions with someone you're going to have a relationship with for the rest of your life. If assume you got
Sure.
It is really difficult, and that's and that doesn't necessarily have to be a clinician of any description, but someone needs to be there to hear and also to be prepared to react and do something if it's really beginning to sound alarming. And alarming is, there's nothing down for me. I know people might be upset at first, but they get over it. They'd be better off without me. These kind of things,
Okay. We talked a little bit about Sachi's goals and some of their definitions and what it is they're trying to achieve on a larger field. For you specifically, what is your specific role in the project? Like, what do you contribute short-term and long-term from a personal standpoint? What do you do?
I'm tempted to make a joke and say, well, I take the glory, actually. Okay, what do I do? Well, I helped to develop the pilot elements of the project, which was the work we did in Mysore from 2010 onwards. A number of small projects, nearly all of which had some quite small funding. I am closely involved in research planning. At the moment, I'm quite closely involved in developing Sachi's got two main elements from which everything else spins out. And the two elements were developing self-harm registers. Now, self-harm registers are well established as a means of understanding self-harm in higher income countries, where generally speaking, they're compiled from routinely collected information in hospitals.
Okay.
That is very difficult in most low and middle income countries. You simply don't have the data systems to collate that kind of information. We so successfully that you could use, you could actually go out and collect information by having dedicated research workers who would find in secondary care people who had harmed themselves and getting clinical and demographic information about them. So having piloted that, we're now developing a much larger secondary care self-harm registers in a number of different locations in both countries. And I've been closely involved in developing things like, okay, how do we make that work? How do we operationalise that work? Do we use standardised instruments, which have all been developed in the West? I'll ask Western type questions. So interestingly, one of the standard questionnaires which we've been thinking about using, developed in the West, gives a whole list, actually developed in the US, it gives about 9 or 10 different ways that you might have tried to kill yourself. It completely omits setting fire to yourself, which is one of the commonest causes in South Asia. So,
Self-immolation.
Yes, self-immolation, indeed, yeah. So I'm developing that work. There's a lot of coordination of work between the two countries and what happens in the UK as well. And My particular role in life seems to be writing things. So when we write research grants, I tend to write the final draft. When we write research papers, I tend to write the final draft. That just seems to be what I do.
Okay. I'm going to skip to another question because you kind of touched on this a little bit in your last answer, but there was a Dr. Nusrat Hussain who stated in his video that 80 to 90% of the global population lives in lower middle income countries, but 80 to 90% of research happens in high income countries. And you were mentioning a little bit, for example, types of suicide.
Yeah.
What other ways does that matter?
Oh, it matters in loads of ways. We study populations that in the West, in developed countries, or high-income countries is a better term, really. Firstly, we tend to study very specialised populations. We tend to study people with very unusually pure versions of particular problems. So if we study people who are depressed, we often study people who are depressed but not drinking. Well, actually, a lot of people who are depressed drink, so you exclude a whole load of people who in the general population have actually got this condition. So you end up knowing what it does for a pure form of depression, but it doesn't tell you so much about depression as it actually occurs in the real world. So even within the population in high-income countries, we tend to select rather distorted specialist populations to study. But even more so, the population in the West represent a lifestyle that isn't so prevalent across the whole of the world. So the first thing is, just straightforward, the mass of humanity do not live within socio-economic circumstances that are prevalent in the US or the UK. And therefore, the knowledge we gain about how things affect that population does not necessarily apply to people who are living in very, very different kinds of lifestyles.
Okay, you gave the example of method of suicide.
Yeah.
Can you give any other examples?
Well, the kind of things that bear upon people. So when we think about domestic disputes, if we think in the UK, I'll stick with the UK because that's not what I know best.
Okay.
You know, quite often we're talking about conflict between the children and their parents, or we're talking about couples where there's either discord or actual violence, and there can be real difficulty, particularly for women leaving violent partners, and that's a well understood phenomenon. In South Asia, people live in family groups where, by and large, when people marry, they move in with the man's family. The woman moves in with the man's family. That's the general pattern. And you've got multi-generational family groups. Now, family discord looks very different in that kind of arrangement. If we think of a woman living in a one-to-one relationship with a man who is being, say, violent towards her, there are all kinds of difficulties and obstructions in getting out of that relationship, but she's escaping predominantly a relationship with one other person. Now, in the context of South Asia, there's a whole other stuff. The extent to which women can be economically independent is very different, particularly in the poorest part of the population. The ramifications of relationship discord, quite often men work away. So in the construction industry, for example, men will often travel quite large distances to work and come back to their families, leaving their wife and their kids with their parents and a larger family group. And if this means that domestic discord and domestic violence plays out in a very different way, and it has to be understood the solutions to that are different to the solutions that might exist in a more dyadic model of relationships.
Professor Naseem Chandri's video, who is also on Sachi and called self-harm a taboo topic. And I was wondering, is it similar to what we're used to in the West, or is it a separate thing? Because in some ways people consider it taboo here, although I think there's been more of a dialogue about it.
There is clearly a taboo, which has been very steadily eroded in recent times. And And in fact, sometimes we even see the opposite in Western culture, a kind of glorification of self-harm. Or romanticisation in some shape and form.
Romeo and Juliet.
Well, yeah, yes, Romeo and Juliet obviously is seen as a tragedy, but I also think of the triumphant death of Thelma and Louise. You know, where it's an act of defiance. You know, we have got some complicated ideas about self-harm and suicide.
I once did a program where I talked about suicide in the Bible. And one of the few examples of suicide, most of the examples of suicide in the Bible are glorious. So you had one example of 2 soldiers who committed suicide rather than be captured, and then there was another one of Samson who kills himself with the help of God to decimate his thousands of enemies by bringing down a building, which reminds me so much of 9/11. But then in the New Testament they have a more I killed myself because I did this horrible thing and I'm racked with guilt. So you have a little bit of a shift in culture between those centuries.
Sure. And then ultimately Judas, of course.
Well, that's what I'm saying, because of shame.
Yeah.
So he was ashamed of what he'd done and he killed himself, which is completely different than these glorious sort of almost militaristic suicide, bring down my enemies. And
So it's multifaceted and we often talk about stigma and we talk about taboo or even shame as if they're unitary phenomena, and I don't think they are. I think they're complex. And I think that I suspect that if we were to do a comparative study, which we're not going to do, between Pakistan and India, I don't think it would be a particularly helpful thing to do. But I think the taboo would be a different one in Islamic and non-Islamic societies, because at the end of the day, Islam, like Catholicism, has an extremely strong prohibition on suicide. Not all religious cultures have the same strength of taboo now, or strength of prohibition. Now, interestingly, older research suggested that the religion in the nation made a big difference to the rates of suicide. So traditionally, Roman Catholic countries recorded much lower rates of suicide than non-Catholic countries.
Did people report it?
Well, exactly. That's exactly the point I'm coming to. You anticipate me. And so far, the work we've done suggests actually it makes much less difference than you'd expect. That actually, that it may not make the difference that people have previously thought.
You mean the prohibition?
The prohibition yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And in fact, that makes some sense if you think about despair.
And then I couldn't help but think of cultures where there's obligatory suicides, right? Like honor suicide, like in Japan. I mean, not now, but in the past, where you had they had the culture of ancestor worship, and it was very honor-based. And so the suicides were associated with an honor.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and then there's also complicated things like the movement to voluntary euthanasia. So in Holland and Oregon, I gather, you can end someone's life because they're terminally ill. Well, that's actually a form of suicide. I'm not condemning it, but what I'm saying is it illustrates the complexity of our understanding, and actually that's seen as a desirable thing by a large part of the population.
Right, but it's still in restricted circumstances, generally where we can't help someone medically. They still don't really apply that to, for example, someone who is suffering depression or someone who...
They don't, no, that's true.
So it wouldn't be... And I don't know, that's a whole other debate about whether or not they should open that up. I have friends who think that that's a good idea. So I have no position on that. But I do understand the distinction.
But the point, I'm not really. I mean, we don't want to open up that debate because we hold our program, wouldn't it? But the point I'm making is about the complexities of our ideas about what's shameful and taboo in self-harm.
Sure.
It is certainly the case that some Muslim countries record zero suicide rates. It's just something that can't be contemplated as a possibility. And that's at the whole other level of taboo than the one that says you're not to
It's
talk
like
about
those
it.
countries where there's no divorce.
Yeah.
Right? They have happy families all the way around, right? No one gets divorced. And so Professor Chandri also noted that policymakers, government officials, and religious leaders need to be pulled into the effort. And so I wanted to, obviously, we come at this from an Atheist Community of Austin perspective. So I'm curious in what ways religion and religious communities could be helpful.
Okay. Well, as you know, I'm an atheist too. However, I've often worked with religious leaders and imams and priests, also rabbis, all kinds of people. I think you utilise what's important to the individual, and if religion is important to the individual, then it's perfectly reasonable to try and engage the positive sides of those resources to help them. And I think that in countries that are very religious, and by and large South Asian countries are very religious, it's very difficult to separate out other forms of social support from religion-based social support. So both Hindu and Muslim and Islam as the predominant religions in the countries that we're working in, you can't separate the two things out. You have to be prepared to work with those religious communities, and I don't have a problem with that. I wouldn't want to ever see proselytization as part of what one does to prevent either of atheism or religion, as what part of what one does to prevent suicide. The important part of it is to work with those people who are important to the person, and certainly you don't have to spend very long in South Asia to realise that if you don't work with within the religious structures that exists, you're not going to reach most of the population. So it's a really important thing to do. That's just part of the culture, and one takes people as one finds them.
And I guess what I'm asking then is, when you partner with them, what is it that they can contribute? Like, in what ways can they assist this effort?
So, well, I think one of the things is to get people to understand a more socio-medical view of depression, of people's problems, and how that leads to people wishing to end their own lives. I think it can be very important to help people to understand what mental illness, how mental illness affects people, and what can be done about mental illness. But as I've said already, mental illness is only one part of it. But also in trying to get communities to work in constructive ways to find community responses to the problem, then engaging with the faith communities that's how these communities are organised to a large extent. It's part of understanding people's social context. I mean,
Sure. So I guess what I'm thinking is, so you go to the religious community leader, and you talk to him and try to raise his or her awareness of how this works and what the dynamics are, and what the medical definitions would be, and what this means to you as a practitioner. And then he takes that information and does what with it?
Well, that might be helping people find ways of getting help. That might be securing professional help for people. That might be organising community action around some of the types of problems that people face. And helping them to see that actually making some shifts in the way that people's lives are constructed can make a big difference to their vulnerability to becoming despairing about their circumstances.
Okay, so helping them organize actual methods of outreach.
Yeah.
In a similar question, I wanted to ask, and to me, it's a bit of a question that, for me, I see the distinction, but I'd like to hear your response to that distinction. So the stigmas or the prohibitions that are tied to something like self-harm or suicide, how would that have a different effect? Like, how would you differentiate that in how it impacts the individual versus a ban against another behavior like theft? Like, don't steal, as opposed to don't kill yourself. What does that mean?
I'm not sure that's right, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, that's why I'm asking you.
Because I think, I don't think it's good for people to steal things.
Right?
And I don't think, generally speaking, it's good for people to kill themselves.
Okay.
I think some types of behaviour, a degree of social condemnation is helpful. So I don't think we should say, yeah, hey, man, it's cool to steal stuff. It isn't cool to steal stuff. It isn't very helpful to have an attitude of condemnation to people who want to end their own lives, because if anything, it's more like to make it happen. Do you follow me?
Right, but this is
I would have a pragmatic view that says, how helpful is it to attach opprobrium to a particular behaviour, and in the case of self-harm, well, most religions would say, or at least more liberal forms of them would say, condemn the sin, not the sinner, and I think that's pretty much how it works with this stuff. I think the fact that you see, clearly I see suicide as undesirable. I do see suicide as undesirable, leaving aside the complications that I so foolishly introduced earlier on with regards to euthanasia. But condemning people doesn't actually do anything to prevent that happening.
And would you say that you would apply that same standard to something like theft?
I think, I guess what I'm saying is, if it worked to simply condemn people, then fine. But I'm not sure it does. So we have a degree of social condemnation for people who steal. And we rightly have criminal penalties for people that steal. Having really severe criminal penalties for people that steal really doesn't help very much.
Sure.
Having some understanding of the things that actually drive people to steal makes quite a big difference. Helping people not to feel like stealing stuff makes quite a big difference.
Sure, so social intervention.
Yeah, but in that case, I would see a degree of a penalty being a very reasonable thing to have. But in the case of wanting to harm yourself, or actually acting to harm yourself, it's fairly clear that it probably makes things worse.
Right, and I guess that's what I was saying is that, did you see a distinction? And I think to some degree what you're saying is there might be some similarities, but there are also distinctions.
Yeah, there's some distinctions, but I think they're dimensional rather than categorical.
Okay. What information would you like to see better understood by the public on the issue of self-harm?
The first thing is that it's not inevitable, that actually things can be done to prevent self-harm. That there's not a simple solution, but nonetheless, coherent action does make quite a big difference. I think I'd like people to understand that it's a good thing to look after people who are feeling despairing, but at the end of the day, if you want to prevent suicide, you have to do things about these major structural factors that we've been talking about, including things like access to means, that may therefore have a nuisance implication for everybody else. So, for example, paracetamol remains a major toxin that people take to kill themselves. If it was always sold with methionine in it, it wouldn't be a major toxin, because this is the antidote to paracetamol poisoning, but it would put up the price of paracetamol quite considerably, which wouldn't help the manufacturers very much, and the general public would have to face an increase in cost. But that, to me, is a price worth paying for the general good.
Sure.
For example.
Well, and we do that with other things too, like, installation of safety features in cars.
Sure.
Drives up the price of cars, and yet it takes out the cost of people getting worse injuries in an accident.
Yeah.
So I understand what you're saying.
So those I think would be the two big things. And the other thing that actually, the intervention that makes a big difference, because people kind of tend to want big big things they can do, but the thing you can do with people is listening to them.
Well, here's a question. What if you know someone who you are being there for?
Yeah.
And they begin to lean on you quite a lot, and
Yeah.
so you start to suggest maybe they should seek better help
Yeah.
or more stable help instead of, because maybe it's too much of a strain on you personally.
Yeah.
What would be a good way to deal with a situation like that?
I think it depends on your relationship, but I think you have to do it. I think it's very important for people not to get drawn into situations they feel out of their depth. It doesn't help either party. It doesn't help the person who's feeling low. It doesn't help you either. I think.
So what do you do?
I think you have to say. I mean, personally, I actually think people are too reluctant just to say it as it is. I think there are plenty of ways of saying, look, I'm beginning to feel quite out of my depth and quite distressed by this. I think we need to get you some help from someone who's more qualified.
What if they won't get help?
Well, there's no solution to everything.
No, I'm just saying. I mean, I can see that there are people in that situation. I think more of like addiction situations than
Sure.
self-harm, which, you know, might...
Well, I think those are very different situations, actually. I think in addiction situations, you've got to be prepared to give up. Or you've got to be prepared to say, my support for you is conditional. And in fact, it seems pretty clear that that's an important thing that people do. In the case of addictions, I'll do this, but you're going to have to do this first. We know that that factors like when there's a tangible benefit, an obvious and immediate tangible benefit to discontinuing substance misuse. So, for example, the circumstance that comes to mind might be the circumstance where someone's got a drink problem and one of their kids say, you can't see your grandkids unless you stop drinking. That we know those kind of factors make quite a big difference actually to people. So that kind of conditional stuff is important. So it shouldn't be unconditional. I think when people who are suicidal, these are much shorter term problems by and large. It is very important people shouldn't feel overburdened. People who are overburdened, because what happens if you begin to feel overburdened is you'll just withdraw suddenly in the end. You just, I can't deal with this anymore. So as you start to feel overburdened, that you start to insist that people get more help. And there is a point at which you have to give up sometimes. And sometimes things will go wrong because no problem has got a perfect set of solutions. But I think that's a really important principle. And one of the things that most people who are involved in helping distressed people know is you've got to have some boundaries for yourself. You can't allow yourself to be crushed by what you're dealing with. Otherwise, you're no good to anyone.
What information would you like to see better researched? So if you could pick one thing that you would just love to get answers to.
That's a very good question. Well, I think, this is now a really difficult question. But I think the really interesting thing in South Asia that we don't know the answer to is these very high rates of suicide. Is this a new phenomenon? Or has it been going on for a long time? And we don't know that. I think there's a perception that it is a new phenomenon. And again, it's very tempting, as someone who's a social psychiatrist, so I'm interested in social factors, to think that's something about globalisation, urbanisation. There are good reasons to think that periods of rapid urbanisation are associated with all kinds of public health problems. It was seen in the Industrial Revolution in Europe in a very major way. That's why, for example, Bazalgette was produced as the sewage system in London because of this, this terrible impact of rapid urbanisation and epidemics of typhoid and cholera. And is that what's happening? Because we're seeing at the moment in South Asia the most rapid urbanisation that's ever happened in history. We're seeing people in a few decades, mega cities forming. With sometimes with good infrastructure, sometimes not with good infrastructure. Now, I'd like to know to what extent what we're seeing is a consequence of that. I'd also love someone to be doing a proper prospective study now, looking at the consequences in the long term. So spinning a little bit off from suicide, there are you remember what I said about inner city deprivation being particularly associated, or growing up in inner city deprivation being particularly associated with developing schizophrenia in later life. Well, it would be really great to know if the current rates of urbanisation in South Asia are going to be associated with a sudden increase in rates of schizophrenia in future generations have grown up in those new cities or in those newly expanded cities. Now there is a really interesting social psychiatry question, just from an abstracted, kind of slightly nerdy kind of scientist point of view.
Okay. And also, what information would you most like policymakers to understand that you think is being lost in this dialogue?
Right, inequality causes mental ill health. That one there, because just looking at UK policy, last 10 years, UK policy has been to increase social inequality in the interests of the British economy. Now, it's actually failed to improve the British economy. We've still got massive problems with the British economy, but it has done untold damage to people's health across the board, including their mental health. If they just took on board that one issue, that would be the one.
Okay. And then I am out of questions, but is there anything else you feel is important to say before we sign off?
Can we stop now?
Yes, we can stop now. So I think I want to thank you again for coming in and sitting down with me. It really wasn't as long as what we'd think. It was just a little over an hour, maybe
okay.
20. Maybe it felt longer, but
well, you've been asking really good questions, but it feels like one of the more difficult exams I've ever done. I don't do exams very often anymore,
Okay. Well, I do want to thank also our producer and our production, Vern, for coming out and helping with this. I think that was really incredible that they were willing to do that, and I hope that people can take advantage of this information and enjoy this interview.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been really great. Thanks.
Okay.